It's great to be here again in the ever-expanding universe of the Craft Brewers Conference. I remember when we could all practically fit under a cabbage leaf, and I'm pretty sure that's what my parents told me that's where breweries came from. But whatever the size of the venue, I think it's important to remember that we all belong to the same tribe, whatever other faction or sect we've chosen to additionally identify with, sour, farmhouse, or 2 hours from the nearest paved road in the middle of Vermont or Wisconsin. Or even those who are so new and so small and so broke that they may not be with us here today. Perhaps they will be next year, the year after that. As independent craft brewers, we have a common brand and legacy to protect. Those little new brewers are part of that, and those of us older and more established are too. It's been 2 years, nearly to the day, that I departed what had become of the brewery that I helped start and which I operated for nearly 20 years. People occasionally ask me how I'm liking my retirement. I'm pretty sure that those who survive the encounter come away knowing that I've actually been fairly busy, though I do have to admit that the proportion of what might be considered work is lower than might be identifiable to the full-time laborer. I've always hesitated, as I'm sure many of you have, when away from home, someone asks me whether it's business or pleasure that brings me to their fair city, since it's almost invariably a mixture of both. Artists maintain that everything they do at every moment in their lives is art. And we might similarly assert that when we're cooking or reading or hanging out with our friends, doing and talking about whatever, that what we're doing or leading up to doing or talking about doing is brewing. That's a theory in progress, by the way. I'll button up the logic of it as my retirement continues. Over the past 2 years, while I haven't done a lot of actual hands-on brewing, I've been doing quite a bit of what might contribute to or analyze or lead up to doing so. I've written approximately a book and a half and various other things on brewing-related topics, and I've traveled a lot all over the world, but across this country again and again, largely on behalf of this organization. In my recently concluded role as BA Quality Ambassador, I had the opportunity at the gatherings of quite a few state brewers guilds to reconnect with old friends and meet a bunch of new ones, many of whom had recently gotten their breweries off the ground. One thing I found was that pretty universally, 50% of the breweries now in operation in any given state have opened within the last 3 years. While some of those new brewers are here with us today, and welcome, brothers and sisters, many others are not. They're home scrubbing their carboys or sourcing acai, or maybe panhandling for Citra or Mosaic on some street corner in Bend or Ballard or Asheville. They maybe can't afford to be here, or to halt operations for a few days to attend a gathering that some of them might feel has little to do with the revolutionary and groundbreaking work they're doing, and which has never before been undertaken by the fat and happy brewers who have been doing business for 4 or more years. This might make you laugh, or it might piss you off. But whichever side of this drifting line of tenure you happen to be on, there's a developing difference of perspective, or maybe it's peer-spective, between larger, more established members of our movement and smaller, less seasoned newcomers who aren't entirely sure they want to belong. Amid our generally cooperative, convivial, and collaborative spirit, I call this the elephant in the brew house. It's kind of inevitable that the sensibilities of one generation will inspire the anti-reaction of the next. That's where the opportunity lies, after all. Earlier models already haven't been taken and developed. What's more, a version of the familiar can become pretty firmly imprinted, even if one ends up in the family business. On the other side, it's not unreasonable to point out that that amber ale, that pale ale, those couple of hybrid lagers put a roof over this movement's head, mister, metaphorically speaking, clearing regulatory brush and taking the early blows from brewers who thought things pretty well settled already. I'm not here to talk literally about succession, at least not today, or to take a side on any actual or figurative generational divide. I'm here to point out once again that we have something precious and strong in common, and that recognizing this might require every one of us to consider other perspectives along the continuum of craft. We've seen this in the issues facing some of our state guilds. We've seen it in the proceedings of some of our members-only meetings. Possibly most alarmingly, we've seen it in the silent willingness of tiny little brewers who might benefit from a little benevolent guidance to go it entirely on their own. But the more particles that arise, the more our movement looks like a wave. I think a lot about improvisation. On the surface, it's something altogether new and off the cuff, spontaneous and fleeting brilliance, never again to be precisely repeated. It's what's fueled a lot of our popular culture, and even more entrenched subcultures. Stand-up comedy is one we think of first. Reacting against the canned and over-repeated jokes of vaudevillians, comics in the 50s and 60s took their material from the newspaper or from suggestions from the audience. Lenny Bruce, Mort Saul, Mike Nichols and Elaine May, Dick Gregory and the Second City troops from Toronto and Chicago made it all look easy and hilarious. At the same time, they provided the ring of truth. Roughly contemporaneous jazz musicians did much the same thing, springing unexpectedly from traditional arrangements. And in the past couple of decades, there's been rap and hip-hop, and even, I suppose, jam bands, seeming in many cases to be pulling magic from the very air. Of course, we're improvisers too. We always have been. Given the lack of scholarship and previous creative precedent, it's a miracle that in those early days we were actually able to make beer. The origin of much of brewing procedure, when it comes down to it, is a series of experimental variations on half-understood themes, hence the enzymatic backflips of all those temperature rests, for example. It's easy these days to point at crazy combinations of fruit or herbs or wood and bacteria and say that this is the golden age of brewing innovation, and perhaps it is. But the first coffee beers, the first really hoppy IPAs, even the first American wheat beers were innovations, improvisations as well. Today's improvising brewers, however old, young, or variously experienced they are, would do well to recognize that it's a long-standing spirit, not a recent battering down of doors, that has fueled the inspiration for new beers for a long time. In fact, for all its immediacy, successful improvisation requires a lot of preparation. The artless scoop, spin, and delivery of a major league shortstop doesn't happen because a new way of doing things just occurred to him. It happens because he's been taking infield practice since he was 4. The individual play may be unique and web gem worthy, but experience and preparation allowed for a possibility of his turning it successfully. Making a delicious and eye-opening double IPA probably means that you've made a bunch of pretty good single ones, possibly hundreds of times. IPA, if truth be told, has been sampled more frequently than the funky drummer. A lot of breweries have made successes of mistakes, specialty malt or dry hopping done twice, barrel-aged beers given up on and then tasted years later. But no less a shaman of spontaneity than George Clinton has observed that there is no chance, coincidence, or accident. What we do happens because we're prepared and willing to do it. Free your mind, and your beer will follow. So if you do something right, like create a great beer, give yourself some credit. You probably did it because you know what you're doing, and not because you're lights out connected to some kind of individual cosmic awesomeness. Similarly, give credit to those who made cognate great moves and great beers in the past, and be prepared to honor those in the future who seem to do so. This isn't something any of us, or any group of us, has a monopoly on. There's a disturbing cultural trend these days to mistrust expertise and accomplishment, to assert that unpreparedness and a resistance to knowledge are virtues better preparing the individual for effective execution and the sweeping away of long-standing difficulty. Well, it's knowledge and experience and a certain sense conferred by repetition that informs our choices when trying to restart a stuck fermentation, or fix a draft problem, or put together a recipe for a beer combining the best elements of a number of beers we've brewed over the course of our careers. It sounds silly to say, but there should be no shame in consistent excellence. Not everything we do, of course, is what we want to do. The right brain side of your business may be coming up with radical beers for the ages, but unless the left brain side of it has been paying the bills and taxes and meeting with distributors and chain buyers and staying in touch with legislators, all that creative freedom is merely theoretical. Brewers might often be considered the faces of their companies, but a harmonious and appreciated whole is what keeps it all going. Similarly, our engaging and perennially newsworthy movement would not have the vibrancy and apparently effortless immediacy it does without the enduring efforts of those who have been around for a while, doing the heavy organizational lifting. When I joined the BA board in about 2006, it was as a pub brewery member. I didn't have a lot to contribute to discussions of the BA's relations with NBWA or the Beer Institute. It was representatives of the larger, generally longer standing and more worldly breweries who were able to talk those subjects up and down, and who put in the time and effort to protect the rights and opportunities of brewers like me up to that point, who hadn't even been aware that such things were things. One thing that dominated discussion over the next couple of years was the definition of what a craft brewer was. And we took heat from both sides. Brewers who, by their business decisions, had chosen to ally with brewers not considered craft, and brewers who, by their identification with small, wondered why brewers on the BA board, who were so much larger than they were considered craft at all. While I believe that alliances with the world's largest brewers move small brewers de facto into a position of ease at odds with the struggles of most of us, I've never understood the need for all that parsing the proof of purity based on gradations of smallness. My good friend Fal Allen back then suggested that the defining division of craft or not had to do with whether you mashed in with a paddle or not. Other brewers I met in Spain held that if you bottled under pressure, you were no longer craft. I submit that the operative and defining implement is bootstraps. If you've made a deal with one of the world's largest and most enabled brewers, you've lost your grip on those. None of us can do this, has done this alone. That's why we call each other up all the time, for help with a source or a process, for a pitching of yeast for the next day's brew. Our biggest craft compatriots are no different, and I bet you've noticed that they answer the phone when you call. Note to bigger, more established craft brewers: make sure you keep answering the rest of us. Note to smaller, newer guys: recognize that we're eager to help you make better beer. Me, I'm neither fish nor fowl these days. It's easy to ignore the realities of the marketplace when delivering the sermon of togetherness, or in fact, if you're the brewer. Many of those aforementioned left-brain types throw up their hands when they hear us sharing techniques, providing contacts, and offering honest criticism and admiration. But that's the secret to our success, and it's not even a secret. The fact that we do this and claim this is a source of enormous consternation and incomprehension to that other side of the industry. What they believe, or seem to believe, and I've been inside that tent, is that ideas are things to be appropriated or bought and then fenced off and protected. What we believe is that ideas are something for everyone. That's one reason we never run out of them. Nor should this be taken for granted. Other artisanal industries haven't managed to bring this along with them once they've moved out of the kitchen or the garage or the basement and emerged into a wider world. I have great love and respect for my friends in the coffee industry, but they don't seem to have the fondness for each other that we do. Chocolate occupies a whole other level of weirdness. And the list goes on: bread, cheese, ice cream, wine, kombucha. For all they do to enhance the quality of our lives, they seem acutely conscious of a limited marketplace putting the squeeze on them. Maybe they know more about business than we do. Maybe they don't. I think in large part it's the nature of the beverage, of the product. It enhances conviviality, sometimes perhaps too much. But when was the last time you suggested to your friends that you get together for a loaf of bread? Of course, there's the other side of it too. Ooh, I hope my friends will still talk to me. I ate too much ice cream last night. That's probably not going to happen. But a big part of why we generally get on so well together is that we drink beer with each other. Another thing I've been doing during my retirement is help Charlie with his archiving project, interviewing the pioneers of our movement, getting them to recall their early challenges and inspirations. A common thread has been that if they had known how difficult and financially unrewarding starting breweries would be, they probably wouldn't have done it. They hadn't done their research, hadn't studied their market. In many cases, going into it all with their eyes closed and without a business plan, and they're laughing when they're telling you all this. I talked with Uli Benowitz, a Bavarian who in 1986 decided to open a brewery, Weeping Radish, in a state where it was illegal to do so, and in a dry county, no less. I talked to Jürgen Knöller, another Bavarian, who in 1987 stopped off in Montana to work at Bayern Brewing on his way to go brew in China. Tiananmen Square happened, and he never left Missoula. I talked to Fritz Maytag. Well, we all know what Fritz did. One very interesting conversation I had was with Dave Thomas, who for many years worked on the malt side at Coors. He's since provided a lot of help and guidance to the craft maltsters now popping up all over the country, and he's involved with a small brewery called Dostal Alley in Central City, Colorado. One story he told was about the reaction at Coors when it was noticed that small breweries were starting to arise. It wasn't crush them. It wasn't buy them. It wasn't make it impossible to do business. It was help them. If you hear of a brewery starting up, get on a plane and go visit them. And that was straight from Bill Coors, who just turned 100, by the way. That is the spirit we all should live by. And they deserve a lot of credit for anticipating the way it would all continue to work for us. Quite a few breweries in Colorado have stories about ways the folks at Coors helped them out. From pointing out that the reason extract was disappointing was that they weren't milling their grain properly, on to more sophisticated lab analysis. Bill's rationale was that there was no reason to compete on the ground level. All that should be encouraged. He was confident that the competition for customers would come through quality on the shelf. It could also be argued that they paid attention to what was happening in the craft segment and made use of some of those ideas. But there's that Q word, quality. That is where we will all compete, with the big brewers and with each other. This is where we as brewers earn our keep, and paradoxically, where those of us who do the best job make it look effortless, even offhand. It's sometimes easy for people outside the craft to take this for granted, to assume that since it's a fundamental part of our jobs, it's okay for it to go unremarked. This misperception can even happen within individual companies. How many instances can you recall where a supposedly big-headed brewer was cut loose, leaving process and execution in the hands of someone less able to keep it all together, or perhaps simply not experienced enough to make it look as though he or she wasn't doing anything? And of course, there's the other side of the quotient, beer that really isn't very good, no matter the size of the ego involved or the size of the brewery. I've drunk a lot of double IPAs that taste like malt liquor, and seen a lot of breweries turn good beer into bad by inexpertly putting it in a can. It would be convenient to draw a corollary between size and quality, assuming that bigger brewers make higher quality beers than smaller ones. They do most often have the labs and sensory programs and equipment and other resources to take some of the guesswork out of brewing, but it isn't consistently true. There are small breweries that take quality seriously, and in my mind, these are the breweries most likely to get bigger. Not that growth should be considered the measure of success, especially these days. If our segment is to grow, and it will, if in fact, according to some projections, the number of US breweries could double in the next several years, a lot of us are going to have to make do with less than what our projections might have indicated. The steady upward line of production and sales can no longer be glibly counted upon to justify and support imprudent investment in equipment and infrastructure. There's simply too much competition to keep lunging for the ring. Protect what you have and make it better. not necessarily bigger, and you'll inspire others to greater quality and control at the same time you ensure yourself a future in this business. My brewery became vulnerable to takeover because of a lack of a coherent mission, a lack of any kind of plan for succession, and a divergence of ideals. Growth was the one thing we could agree on, and even then there were fundamental differences of interpretation. Without a real philosophical plan, it's easy to drift to that silent planet of solitary uncertainty. It sounds simple once again, but we all need to keep talking, both to keep our own houses in order and to keep these pressures and uncertainties from separating us into factions. As I finish up here, I want to circle back to my main message of unity, of respect across lines of continuity and accomplishment, of recognizing that being a mainstay isn't boring, that being crazy and new doesn't mean you don't know what you're doing, and we are one organization for a reason. Any disagreements that might arise are not cause for some kind of division, but only family arguments. It's even okay for us to yell at each other once in a while. The fact that some of us will leave our fold isn't cause for general hand-wringing, though it is a threat to be recognized. Neither is the fact that there will be hundreds of new breweries before you know it. We need to continue to demonstrate the benefits and the cultural strength of remaining independent. It's the only way we will continue to be there for each other. Together, we've saved an industry and inspired the rest of the world. Only together can we preserve the independence of craft brewing. Thanks for getting up and showing up.